The sun was setting over Sycamore Estates, painting the row of nearly identical houses in shades of orange and gold. It had been a peaceful neighborhood once, before Margaret Winters took over. That's what the old-timers said, at least. Margaret moved into the corner house with the perfect lawn 5 years ago. Back then, she was just another newcomer, a bit standoffish, but nothing out of the ordinary. She'd smile tight-lipped when passing neighbors on her daily power walks, designer sunglasses hiding her sharp eyes, a silver-streaked blonde bob never moving an inch in the wind. At community picnics, she'd sit a little apart, watching everyone with an intensity that made some folks uncomfortable. Just shy, some neighbors said. Others weren't so sure. Nobody paid much attention when she first joined the Homeowners Association board. Just another retiree with time on her hands, looking for something to do. But when the old president stepped down due to health problems, Margaret was quick to raise her hand. "I have extensive management experience," she told everyone at the election meeting, standing straight-backed in her crisp pantsuit. "I ran operations for a Fortune 500 company for 20 years. I know how to maintain standards and protect investments." The vote wasn't even close. Most people didn't bother showing up for HOA meetings anyway. Those who did liked what they heard about protecting property values and maintaining community standards. After all, that's why many of them had moved to Sycamore Estates in the first place, for the tidy lawns and uniform appearance that promised stability and order. The changes started small. The community newsletter, once a friendly monthly bulletin, became a list of violations and warnings. The fonts got smaller, the language more formal, the tone less neighborly. The first round of violation notices appeared in mailboxes just 2 weeks after Margaret took office. Tom Johnson found one tucked inside his mailbox for lawn height exceeding regulation by 0.75 inches. The Patels received a notice about unauthorized wind chimes producing excessive noise pollution. Mrs. Lopez, a widow who'd lived in the neighborhood since it was built, got one for decorative elements inconsistent with community aesthetic guidelines. She put out a ceramic frog her grandchildren had painted for her. "It's nothing personal," Margaret would say when confronted, her voice smooth and reasonable. "Rules are rules. We all agreed to them when we moved here." By month 3, the neighborhood started to change. Gardens became simpler, more uniform. Colorful decorations disappeared. Cars were neatly parked in driveways or tucked away in garages. Children played more quietly, looking over their shoulders if they laughed too loudly. Then came the community improvement gifts. Margaret started a program using HOA funds to beautify the neighborhood. Stone garden markers appeared at property lines. Decorative birdhouses were mounted on trees. Solar-powered path lights were installed along walkways. All identical, all approved by Margaret herself. "It's to create a consistent look," she explained at the quarterly meeting, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation showing before and after photos. Studies show coordinated landscaping elements can increase property values by up to 15%. Few noticed how Margaret's eyes lit up when she mentioned the new cameras at the neighborhood entrances. "For security purposes only," she assured everyone. "The footage will be reviewed by the board if any incidents occur." What Margaret didn't mention was the tiny lens hidden in each garden stone, each birdhouse, each path light. She didn't mention the monitors installed in her home office, displaying feeds from every part of the neighborhood. She didn't mention the notebooks where she recorded neighbors' comings and goings, their visitors, their private conversations carried across summer air through open windows. Margaret Winters smiled as she closed her curtains each night, settling in to watch her neighbors on the screens. In just 3 months, she'd established control. In her mind, she wasn't being nosy, she was bringing order to chaos, standards to a community that needed a firm hand. And if that meant knowing everyone's secrets, well, that was simply the price of perfect order. Little did she know that her perfect system had one flaw, and that flaw would soon bring her whole operation crashing down. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the first truly strange thing happened. Teenage Bobby Johnson was sitting on his front porch steps, texting his friends about sneaking out later that night to the abandoned railroad tracks. Just harmless teenage stuff. No drinking, no drugs, just the thrill of breaking curfew and feeling like rebels for once. He'd heard the click-clack of heels on the sidewalk before he saw her. Margaret Winters, in her pressed khaki pants and blue blouse, walking straight toward the Johnson house with that plastic smile that never reached her eyes. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Margaret said, stopping at the edge of their lawn. "Your mother home, Bobby?" Before he could answer, Margaret continued, "I wanted to discuss the plans you're making for tonight. The railroad tracks are private property, you know. Trespassing comes with a $500 fine in this county." Bobby's mouth fell open. He'd only texted his friends. He hadn't said a word out loud. "I don't know what you're talking about," he mumbled, shoving his phone deep into his pocket. Margaret's smile tightened. "Just passing along information. Thought you might want to know." She walked away, leaving Bobby staring after her, a cold feeling spreading in his stomach. That same week, the Patels were in their master bedroom, hanging new curtains, deep burgundy ones that Mrs. Patel had fallen in love with at the home goods store. "They're a bit bold for the neighborhood," Mr. Patel had said, but his wife insisted. "Our bedroom faces the backyard. Who's going to see?" They'd barely finished hanging the second panel when their doorbell rang. Mr. Patel opened the door to find Margaret, holding a clipboard and wearing latex gloves. "Good afternoon. I'm here about the unauthorized window coverings." Her voice was pleasant, but her eyes were cold. Section 7, Paragraph 4 of the HOA guidelines clearly states that all window coverings visible from the exterior must be neutral in tone. Mr. Patel frowned. "But we just put them up. How did you?" "A neighbor reported it," Margaret said smoothly. "I'm just following up. You'll need to remove them by tomorrow, or there's a $25 daily fine." She was already walking away when Mrs. Patel joined her husband at the door. They exchanged worried glances. Their bedroom faced a fenced backyard with no neighbors able to see inside. Who could have reported them so quickly? 3 days later, old Mr. Wilson was arranging his garden gnome collection on a new shelf he'd built in his garage. He'd moved them from the yard after getting violation notices, but couldn't bear to pack them away completely. His late wife had collected them, one from each place they'd traveled together over their 47-year marriage. He was placing the last one, a cheerful gnome riding a turtle from their trip to the Florida Keys, when he heard a throat clear behind him. He turned to find Margaret standing in his garage doorway. "Those will need to be kept out of sight completely, Mr. Wilson," she said, nodding toward the gnomes. "Even in the garage, if the door is ever open, they're visible from the street." "But I just set this up," Mr. Wilson said, his voice shaking slightly. "Haven't even opened the garage door today." Margaret shrugged. "Just preventing a future violation. Better safe than sorry." As she walked away, Mr. Wilson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the garage's temperature. Something wasn't right. Margaret couldn't have known about the gnomes. By the end of the month, neighbors started noticing patterns. Margaret knew things she shouldn't know. She knew when packages were delivered to backyards. She knew who had visitors after 9 p.m. She knew which teenagers were dating against their parents' wishes. At the corner coffee shop just outside the neighborhood, people started talking in hushed voices. "She told me to move my garbage can 10 minutes after I put it out too early," said a woman from Seaver Street. "But I was home alone. Nobody could have seen." "She knew my daughter had a B on her math test before I did," said a man from Maple Drive. "Stopped me while walking my dog to suggest a tutor she knew." "How does she always know?" someone whispered. Nobody had an answer, but the question hung in the air. People started checking over their shoulders before speaking, even inside their own homes. Some drew blinds that had always stayed open. Others took to whispering to their spouses, even with doors closed. Something was happening in Sycamore Estates, something that made the hair on the back of people's necks stand up. Margaret Winters somehow had eyes everywhere, and nobody knew how. But someone was about to find out. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the first truly strange thing happened. Teenage Bobby Johnson was sitting on his front porch steps, texting his friends about sneaking out later that night to the abandoned railroad tracks. Just harmless teenage stuff. No drinking, no drugs, just the thrill of breaking curfew and feeling like rebels for once. He'd heard the click-clack of heels on the sidewalk before he saw her. Margaret Winters, in her pressed khaki pants and blue blouse, walking straight toward the Johnson house with that plastic smile that never reached her eyes. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Margaret said, stopping at the edge of their lawn. "Your mother home, Bobby?" Before he could answer, Margaret continued, "I wanted to discuss the plans you're making for tonight. The railroad tracks are private property, you know. Trespassing comes with a $500 fine in this county." Bobby's mouth fell open. He'd only texted his friends. He hadn't said a word out loud. "I don't know what you're talking about," he mumbled, shoving his phone deep into his pocket. Margaret's smile tightened. "Just passing along information. Thought you might want to know." She walked away, leaving Bobby staring after her, a cold feeling spreading in his stomach. That same week, the Patels were in their master bedroom, hanging new curtains, deep burgundy ones that Mrs. Patel had fallen in love with at the home goods store. "They're a bit bold for the neighborhood," Mr. Patel had said, but his wife insisted. "Our bedroom faces the backyard. Who's going to see?" They'd barely finished hanging the second panel when their doorbell rang. Mr. Patel opened the door to find Margaret, holding a clipboard and wearing latex gloves. "Good afternoon. I'm here about the unauthorized window coverings." Her voice was pleasant, but her eyes were cold. Section 7, Paragraph 4 of the HOA guidelines clearly states that all window coverings visible from the exterior must be neutral in tone. Mr. Patel frowned. "But we just put them up. How did you?" "A neighbor reported it," Margaret said smoothly. "I'm just following up. You'll need to remove them by tomorrow, or there's a $25 daily fine." She was already walking away when Mrs. Patel joined her husband at the door. They exchanged worried glances. Their bedroom faced a fenced backyard with no neighbors able to see inside. Who could have reported them so quickly? 3 days later, old Mr. Wilson was arranging his garden gnome collection on a new shelf he built in his garage. He'd moved them from the yard after getting violation notices, but couldn't bear to pack them away completely. His late wife had collected them, one from each place they'd traveled together over their 47-year marriage. He was placing the last one, a cheerful gnome riding a turtle from their trip to the Florida Keys, when he heard a throat clear behind him. He turned to find Margaret standing in his garage doorway. "Those will need to be kept out of sight completely, Mr. Wilson," she said, nodding toward the gnomes. "Even in the garage, if the door is ever open, they're visible from the street." "But I just set this up," Mr. Wilson said, his voice shaking slightly. "Haven't even opened the garage door today." Margaret shrugged. "Just preventing a future violation. Better safe than sorry." As she walked away, Mr. Wilson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the garage's temperature. Something wasn't right. Margaret couldn't have known about the gnomes. By the end of the month, neighbors started noticing patterns. Margaret knew things she shouldn't know. She knew when packages were delivered to backyards. She knew who had visitors after 9 p.m. She knew which teenagers were dating against their parents' wishes. At the corner coffee shop just outside the neighborhood, people started talking in hushed voices. "She told me to move my garbage can 10 minutes after I put it out too early," said a woman from Seba Street. "But I was home alone. Nobody could have seen." "She knew my daughter had a B on her math test before I did," said a man from Maple Drive. "Stopped me while walking my dog to suggest a tutor she knew." "How does she always know?" someone whispered. Nobody had an answer, but the question hung in the air. People started checking over their shoulders before speaking, even inside their own homes. Some drew blinds that had always stayed open. Others took to whispering to their spouses, even with doors closed. Something was happening in Sycamore Estates, something that made the hair on the back of people's necks stand up. Margaret Winters somehow had eyes everywhere, and nobody knew how. But someone was about to find out. Lin Chen had only been living in Sycamore Estates for 3 weeks when she first crossed paths with Margaret Winters. As a cybersecurity specialist who worked from home, Lin valued her privacy. She'd chosen this neighborhood precisely because it seemed quiet and well-maintained. That Tuesday morning, she put her garbage bin out at 7:58 a.m. The HOA rules stated bins couldn't go out before 8 o'clock a.m., but Lin had an early video meeting and didn't want to forget. Just 2 minutes early, who would even notice? Margaret Winters would. At 5:07 p.m., Lin found a lime green envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a printed violation notice for improper garbage bin placement outside of designated hours. The fine was $30. Lin stared at the notice, baffled. She worked from her home office at the back of the house, curtains drawn all day for her computer screens. No one had driven by. No one had walked past, she was certain. So how did Margaret know? The next day, Lynn walked to the community mailboxes and casually chatted with an older couple checking their mail. "Oh, Margaret," the woman said when Lynn mentioned the HOA president. "She sees everything. Best to just follow the rules to the letter." "But how?" Lynn asked. "Does she have cameras or something?" The couple exchanged glances. "We've wondered the same thing," the man admitted in a low voice. "Last month, she knew our grandson stayed overnight without a visitor pass, but we picked him up from the airport at midnight. Nobody was around." Lynn couldn't stop thinking about it as she walked home. As someone who worked in security, something felt very wrong here. Either Margaret was stalking people around the clock, which seemed impossible for one person, or she had some way of watching everyone. The next day, Lynn began to pay attention to the neighborhood in a different way. Instead of admiring the neat gardens and coordinated decorations, she looked for anything unusual, anything that could be watching. She noticed them first along her walking route, small garden lights with oddly thick bases, decorative stones that all faced toward the street, birdhouses placed at unusual angles. Each home had at least one item that seemed out of place if you really looked. Outside her own home was a solar garden light that she didn't remember buying. Had it been there when she moved in? She'd been so busy unpacking, she hadn't paid attention. That night after dark, Lynn took out a flashlight and examined the garden light more closely. The solar panel on top looked normal, but when she shined her light at just the right angle, she spotted it, a tiny pinhole lens, nearly invisible, pointed directly at her front door. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't just a garden light. It was a camera. Lynn carefully put the light back exactly as she'd found it. Inside her house, she closed all blinds and sat in her darkened living room, thinking, if one decorative item contained a hidden camera, what about the others throughout the neighborhood? The next day, Lynn bought a signal detector, a small device used to locate wireless cameras and microphones. She disguised it as a fitness tracker on her wrist and took another walk around the neighborhood. The device vibrated near the decorative stone on the Petersons' lawn, again near the birdhouse at the corner of Elm and Maple, again near the new bench at the neighborhood playground. These weren't just random decorations. The whole neighborhood was under surveillance. But how was Margaret getting the footage? And where was she storing it all? A system this extensive would need a central hub, a computer network to manage it. Lynn remembered something else. When she'd first moved in, Margaret had stopped by with a welcome basket. She'd insisted on coming inside, commenting on Lynn's furniture placement and suggesting better positions for her couch and dining table. Had she been scouting locations for indoor cameras too? Lynn shuddered at the thought. Her work involved sensitive information, client data that was protected by strict privacy laws. If Margaret had placed cameras inside her home, she needed proof, not just for herself, but for everyone in the neighborhood. And she needed to find out exactly how far this surveillance network went. As Lynn reached a driveway, she noticed Margaret across the street, pruning roses and watching her with that tight smile. Lynn waved cheerfully, pretending everything was normal. The game was on. Margaret might think she knew everything about everyone in Sycamore Estates, but she had no idea who she was dealing with now. Lynn knew she had to be careful. Every move she made outside her home could be watched by Margaret. She began covering her tracks, creating a normal-looking routine while secretly gathering evidence. During her morning walks, she used her signal detector to map every hidden camera in the neighborhood. By the end of the week, she'd found 32 cameras hidden in plain sight, garden lights, budded boughs, decorative stones, even a cute little garden gnome on the Rodriguez family's lawn. All seemingly innocent gifts from Margaret's neighborhood beautification program. But where did all this footage go? The cameras were wireless, which meant they had to transmit somewhere nearby. The answer came on Saturday morning. Lynn was working in her garden when the HOA landscaping truck rolled down the street. The truck stopped at each house with hidden cameras, and a worker checked each device quickly. Not to fix them, to replace tiny memory cards. Lynn watched through her sunglasses, pretending to focus on her flowers. The worker never knocked on doors or spoke to homeowners. He just quietly serviced the cameras and moved on. She followed at a distance when he finished the route. The truck drove straight to Margaret's house and parked in the back alley. The worker carried a small box, likely full of memory cards, to Margaret's back door. This was it, physical evidence. But Lynn needed more to convince the neighborhood. That night, Lynn used her technical skills to detect the wireless networks in the area. Among the usual home Wi-Fi networks, she found an unusual signal coming from Margaret's house, a private network using a different frequency than standard home internet. For 3 days, Lynn documented everything: camera locations, the weekly memory card collection, the unusual network. But she needed to know exactly what Margaret was doing with all that footage. Her chance came unexpectedly. The neighborhood newsletter announced that Margaret would represent Sycamore Estates at a regional HOA conference on Wednesday. She'd be gone all day. Lynn took the day off work. As soon as Margaret's car disappeared down the street, Lynn pulled on her running clothes and set out for her usual morning jog, except today, she had a small electronic device in her pocket. As she passed Margaret's house, she activated it, causing a brief disruption in the power grid on the block. Lights flickered in several homes. Lynn stopped, pretending to tie her shoe while watching Margaret's house. As she hoped, a man in an electrical company uniform arrived 20 minutes later. The backup generator had activated, triggering an automatic service call. Power surge knocked out some equipment, the electrician told Lynn, who had circled back around. Happens with all this sensitive computer stuff people have nowadays. Oh, Margaret has a lot of computers? Lynn asked innocently. Like a nicer control room in there, the man laughed. Never seen so many monitors in a home. She said she does stock trading or something. That was all Lynn needed to hear. When the electrician left, Lynn knocked on doors of neighbors she'd come to trust over the past week. People who had also felt uneasy about Margaret's all-seeing knowledge. The Johnsons, whose teenage son had been caught texting about sneaking out. The Wilsons with their garden gnome collection. The Pettles with their burgundy curtains. One by one, she showed them her evidence, photos of the hidden cameras on their properties, the schedule of memory card collections, the unusual network setup. She's not just enforcing HOA rules, Lynn explained to the stunned group gathered in the Johnsons' living room. This is an invasion of privacy. According to the electrician, she has multiple monitors set up in her home. She's watching all of us. But why? Mrs. Patel asked, hugging herself as if suddenly cold. Mr. Wilson shook his head slowly. Control. Pure and simple. There's more, Lynn said quietly. From what I can tell, these cameras have been in place for months. Some of them can pick up sound if they're close enough to windows. She potentially has recordings of private conversations, children playing, everything. A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications sank in. What do we do? Bobby Johnson's father finally asked. Lynn looked around at the worried faces. We need more evidence. We need to see exactly what she has. And then we take it all to the quarterly HOA meeting next week. What none of them realized was that while Margaret's main system was down for repairs, one camera was still working, the one hidden in the wreath on the Johnsons' front door. The morning after their meeting at the Johnsons' house, Lynn found another violation notice in her mailbox. This one cited unauthorized gathering without proper event registration and included a $50 fine. Margaret knew. Lynn immediately texted the others. She's watching. Meet at the coffee shop outside the neighborhood, 7 p.m. The Coffee Bean Cafe sat just beyond the boundaries of Sycamore Estates, safely out of Margaret's surveillance network. By 7:15, 8 neighbors had gathered in the back room, speaking in hushed voices despite being away from Margaret's cameras. She fined all of us, Mrs. Patel said, showing her notice. How did she know we met? Lynn explained about the wreath camera they'd missed. We have to be more careful. No more meetings in the neighborhood at all. Mr. Johnson, whose teenage son Bobby had been caught texting about sneaking out, leaned forward. My brother's a lawyer. He says what she's doing isn't just creepy, it's illegal. Recording people without consent, especially in private spaces like backyards, that's criminal. We need solid proof, Lynn said. My word against hers won't be enough, especially with her standing in the community. The group fell silent, considering the challenge. Then Mrs. Wilson, a retired school librarian, spoke up. I've been thinking about this all day. Margaret keeps files on everyone, right? She must have records, notes from her surveillance. Probably on her computer system, Lynn nodded. But what if there's more? Mrs. Wilson continued. People like Margaret, who need to control everything, they often keep detailed physical records too. My sister was married to a man like that. He had files on everyone in their family, what they did wrong, when they disappointed him, all written down to use against them later. Lynn considered this. We'd need to see inside her house to know for sure. Actually, Mr. Patel said slowly there might be a way. As the HOA treasurer, Mr. Patel explained he was supposed to meet with Margaret monthly to review finances. She's been putting it off for weeks, but I could insist, say the board is asking questions. She'd have to let me in. And while you're reviewing finances, Lynn began. I could look around, he finished. Nothing obvious. Just observe. They formed a plan. Mr. Patel would request an urgent meeting. Mrs. Rodriguez, who worked at the cell phone store, would provide tiny cameras disguised as shirt buttons for Mr. Patel to wear. Lynn would create a secure way for them to share and store evidence. Over the next 3 days, their coalition grew. The Thompsons joined after Margaret fined them for their daughter's basketball hoop, which had been approved by the previous HOA board. The Garcias joined when they received a violation for speaking Spanish too loudly in their backyard. 2 more families from Maple Street came aboard after finding cameras hidden in decorative planters Margaret had gifted them. They met nightly at different locations outside the neighborhood, the library, the park 2 miles away, a diner on the highway. Each person shared their stories of Margaret's surveillance and manipulation. She told my husband about my sister visiting when he was on a business trip, Mrs. Thompson revealed. I never told him because they don't get along. It caused a huge fight when Margaret mentioned it like he already knew. She threatened to report my home business to the city unless I voted her way on the pool renovation, Mr. Garcia said quietly. Lynn documented everything, building a case, but they needed hard evidence of the surveillance system itself. Their chance came sooner than expected. Mr. Patel's financial meeting with Margaret was scheduled for Friday afternoon. They prepared him carefully, what to look for, how to act natural, where to position himself for the button cameras to capture the room. Remember, Lynn told him as they did a final check of the equipment, if you see anything suspicious, don't react. Just note it mentally and keep the conversation normal. What if she catches me? Mr. Patel asked, voicing the fear they all shared. Then we move to Plan B immediately, Lynn said firmly. But let's hope it doesn't come to that. None of them spoke about what Plan B actually was. They were ordinary people, parents, workers, retirees, not spies or detectives. They were scared, but more than that, they were angry. Margaret had invaded their privacy, used their secrets against them, made them feel unsafe in their own homes. As Mr. Patel left for his meeting with Margaret, carrying financial folders and wearing the hidden camera, the rest of the group waited anxiously at the library 2 miles away. What he would discover would shock even them, who'd thought they knew the worst of Margaret's surveillance already. The quarterly HOA meeting was held in the community center, a small building with beige walls and uncomfortable folding chairs. Usually, only a handful of residents would show up, but today the room was packed. People stood along the walls, whispering to each other. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Margaret arrived exactly on time, wearing a crisp blue blazer and pearl earrings. She paused at the door, surprised by the turnout, before composing her face into its usual tight smile. "My goodness," she said, walking to the front table. "What a wonderful show of community interest today." What Margaret didn't know was what Mr. Patel had discovered during their financial meeting. In her home office, behind a bookshelf that slid aside, he had glimpsed a room lined with monitors, screens showing live feeds from all over the neighborhood. But worse than that were the filing cabinets. While pretending to take a phone call in the hallway, he had quickly opened one drawer. Inside were folders on every household, labeled with names and addresses, containing printed photos, notes, and what looked like transcripts of private conversations. He'd managed to snap pictures of several folders with his button camera before Margaret returned. Now, as Margaret called the meeting to order, Lynn nodded to Mr. Johnson, who stood up. "Before we get to the agenda," he said, his voice firm despite his nervous hands, "we have an urgent community matter to discuss." Margaret's smile didn't waver. Any new business needs to be submitted in writing 2 weeks before the meeting. You know the rules, Richard. This can't wait, Mrs. Patel said, standing up next to her husband. It concerns the safety and privacy of everyone in this room. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. What are you talking about? Lynn stood up then, carrying her laptop. We're talking about this, Margaret. She connected the computer to the projector, and suddenly the wall displayed a map of Sycamore Estates, with red dots marking every hidden camera location they'd discovered. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people looked confused, others angry. What is this nonsense? Margaret asked, but her voice had lost its usual confidence. These red dots, Lynn explained to the room, show the locations of hidden cameras placed throughout our neighborhood. Cameras disguised as garden decorations, lights, and other innocent-looking items. Cameras that were provided through the HOA beautification program run by Margaret. People began to shift in their seats, looking around at each other. That's ridiculous, Margaret said. This is slander. I'll have you all fined for. For what? Mr. Wilson interrupted. For exposing the truth? For discovering that you've been spying on all of us for months? Mr. Patel stood next. 2 days ago, I saw inside Margaret's home during our financial meeting. She has a hidden room with monitors showing footage from all these cameras, and filing cabinets full of information on every family in Sycamore Estates. He clicked to the next slide, pictures of the monitor room and the open file drawer, clearly visible despite the hurried photography. A shocked silence fell over the room, followed by outbursts of anger and disbelief. She knew my son was sneaking out before he even left the house. She commented on our new furniture that you can only see from our backyard. She threatened to expose my medical condition if I didn't support her pool renovation plan. Margaret's face had gone pale, but she tried to regain control. As HOA president, I have a responsibility to maintain community standards. The cameras are for security purposes only. Is that why you have recordings of private conversations from people's backyards? Lynn asked, clicking to another slide showing transcripts from Margaret's files. Is that why you've been using private information to manipulate people into following your rules? To blackmail them? The room erupted in anger. People stood, shouting questions and accusations. Mrs. Rodriguez, usually quiet at these meetings, raised her voice above the chaos. My daughter was recorded in our backyard pool. She's 14 years old. That's not just wrong, it's illegal. An older man in the back stood up. I'm a retired police officer. What you've done here, Margaret, is criminal. Multiple violations of privacy laws, potential blackmail, recording minors without consent. I'm calling the police right now. Margaret's composure finally cracked. You all agreed to the HOA rules. I was just enforcing them. Someone has to maintain standards in this community. Not by spying on us, Lynn said firmly. Not by recording our private moments. Not by using our personal information against us. As the retired officer made his call by the door, Margaret looked around the room, searching for supporters and finding none. For the first time, the neighborhood saw real fear in her eyes. The power she had built so carefully, camera by camera, secret by secret, was crumbling before her. 3 months after the explosive HOA meeting, Sycamore Estates felt like a different neighborhood. The spring flowers were blooming, children played freely in front yards, and neighbors chatted over fences without looking over their shoulders. The police had arrived that night, taking statements from residents and seizing Margaret's surveillance equipment. The evidence was overwhelming. Over 30 hidden cameras, years of recorded footage, detailed files on every family, and even transcripts of private conversations she'd used to manipulate people. Margaret faced multiple charges for illegal surveillance and invasion of privacy. In the end, she accepted a plea deal, 2 years of probation, significant fines, and a restraining order preventing her from coming within 500 feet of Sycamore Estates or contacting any residents. Her house stood empty now, a for sale sign swaying in the breeze. Nobody wanted to buy the spy house, as neighborhood kids had nicknamed it. Some residents had suggested turning it into a community center, but that would take time and money they didn't have yet. The Johnsons hosted the first neighborhood barbecue since the scandal, their backyard filled with folding tables, coolers of drinks, and the smell of grilling burgers. People moved easily between yards, no longer worried about property line violations or unapproved gatherings. Mr. Wilson's garden gnomes had returned to their place of honor along his front walkway. Mrs. Patel had hung colorful curtains in every window of her house, and no one said a word about community aesthetic standards. "It's like we can breathe again," Mrs. Rodriguez said, sipping lemonade as she watched her children play tag with the other neighborhood kids. "I didn't realize how stressed I was all the time until it stopped." Not everything had been easy in the aftermath. Some families couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even after all the cameras were removed. The Thompsons had decided to move, unable to feel comfortable in a home where their privacy had been so violated. 2 other families had followed suit. But most stayed, determined to rebuild their community on a foundation of trust rather than fear. Lin Chen sat on the Johnsons' back porch, watching the neighborhood come together. After the scandal broke, people had overwhelmingly voted her in as the new HOA president, despite her protests that she was too new to the neighborhood. "We need someone who understands boundaries," Mr. Patel had insisted. "Someone who values privacy and community equally." Lin had accepted on one condition, that they completely rewrite the HOA bylaws together as a community. That process was now underway. The new rules were simpler, focused on safety and maintenance rather than control and uniformity. Enforcement relied on open communication instead of fines and threats. Most importantly, they added explicit privacy protections and limits on the HOA board's powers. "Thinking about the changes?" Mrs. Wilson asked, sitting down beside Lin with a paper plate of potato salad. Lin nodded. "It's amazing how quickly things turned around. But there's still work to do." "True," Mrs. Wilson agreed. "Some people are still jumpy. My husband checks the garden lights every morning just to be sure." "That might take time," Lin said. "Trust does." Across the yard, Mr. Johnson was showing Bobby and some other teenagers how to set up a volleyball net. The HOA had just approved a community volleyball court on the empty lot at the end of the street, something Margaret had blocked for years, claiming it would attract undesirable elements. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Mrs. Wilson said after a moment. "All those recordings and files Margaret kept. She thought they gave her power over us." "They did for a while," Lin pointed out. "Yes, but in the end, they brought us together. We might never have really known each other without this happening. Before, we were just houses next to each other, not neighbors." Lin looked around at the gathering. People who had been strangers 3 months ago were now friends planning community gardens and movie nights under the stars. The last HOA newsletter, now a friendly community bulletin rather than a list of violations, sat on the table beside them. The front page featured a photo of the first neighborhood cleanup day, with residents of all ages working together. The headline read, "Building Community Through Trust." Mr. Patel walked over with a tray of ice cream sandwiches. "For the planning committee," he said with a smile, "we have to finalize the summer block party schedule." As the 3 of them went over the plans, other neighbors drifted over to join the conversation, offering ideas and volunteering to help. No one mentioned Margaret or the cameras. They didn't need to. Sycamore Estates had moved on, stronger and more united than before. The neighborhood Margaret had tried to control through fear now thrived on something she had never understood: the power of community built on respect, not rules.